When it comes to race and pass, and really, it boils down to when we were all kids, right? You're doing fire drills and stuff in elementary school and junior high and high school. It's important. And the reason being is a surgical fire is a serious event. It's kind of like an emergency situation, right? It's something that no one expects. Yes, it's rare, but the effects can be catastrophic.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Kamil Makhnejia, VP of Clinical Development at Jackson Medical. And Melanie, we're going to be talking about fire safety today. And I know that you got to have a really strong conversation with Kamil leading up to this interview. And so I'm excited because I think sometimes we all look at fire safety and go, yeah, that's covered in orientation. I'm all set.
Exactly. We do. And we get used to it and it becomes standard practice. And then you hear about the stories where patients were severely burned or where a fire broke out and people didn't know what to do. And so I think that it is great to be talking about this, to have somebody who really understands the ins and outs of fire safety to be sharing it with everyone. And I think we can all learn a lot just by listening to this conversation.
All right. We're going to be right back after a short break with Kamil Makhnejia.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Kamil Makhnejia, VP of Clinical Development at Jackson Medical. And today we are going to be talking all about fire safety. And we have had a few episodes lately, Melanie, focusing on different areas of safety. So I'm looking forward to continuing that discussion with you today, Kamil. Welcome to the show.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me, especially on such timely occasions with Fire Prevention Week. So happy to be here.
Before we dive right into the fire, or before we throw you to the fire, why don't we talk about your background? Why don't you talk about your experience and how you wound up in your role as the VP of Clinical Development?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Jackson Medical, we're a startup company that spun out of Georgia Tech. We're based out of Atlanta, Georgia, down here in the Southeast. And I landed into this VP of Clinical Development role kind of in a circuitous manner. Really, I'm an engineer by training. And for me, what really kind of, gets me passionate about healthcare is not only about helping out patients and doing what we can to serve our patients, but also the workflows that are involved. Healthcare is pretty complex. I mean, there's so many different facets to it, and it's one of the more complicated and complex industries that are out there. And so we're thinking about workflows and thinking about staffing and how people are trained and procedures, protocols. All of that stuff is really interesting to me, the human factors component to it. And in addition, having an engineering background, thinking about and designing different engineered solutions that fit into these workflows is something that I'm really passionate about as well. And I feel like in this position, being out in the field as well as in the lab helps out a lot to be able to translate those skills and facets back and forth.
That's so critical. I just think sometimes you really have that separated where you have the people that, are designing, developing, or sometimes in service organizations, repairing. But that team doesn't get to necessarily talk to the end user, and the translation of what the field-based team members are getting back to the internal team members. Sometimes I feel like the value everybody's trying to do the right thing, but that it gets lost in translation and actual product development all the time.
Absolutely. It's like playing telephone, right? And so what we try to do, at least in our company, is get the engineers out there as well, shadowing different teams and surgeons and different specialties, because that makes a big difference. That clinical immersion plays a huge role, for us as engineers to be able to provide a product and a service that meets the needs of the end users.
Yeah, I love that. Getting out into the field like that. Okay, so let's start talking about surgical fires and maybe just define what we're talking about, because, there's surgical site fires, there's surgical fires. Let's set the context here.
So surgical fires are a bit all-encompassing. You can have a multitude of different causes and characteristics of these surgical fires. So, of course, you've got your more common ones, where a patient accidentally gets set on fire. You've got other instances of surgical fires that happen when equipment, for example, malfunctions, maybe a generator or something like that shorts, and you have a fire that results from there. In addition to that, surgical fires and related patient burns can occur from a number of other different areas as well. For example, electrosurgical devices. And AORN has great guidelines that highlight the safety that's involved with electrosurgical safety and how that tees up with surgical fire safety as well. Now, what's really unique about surgical fires is that although they fall under the umbrella of sentinel events, which are well defined nationally, so sentinel events are well characterized and defined nationally, the reporting structures do vary state by state based on which sentinel events are reported based on what the states deem to be most impactful.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me that they don't all consider it a sentinel event on kind of a consistent basis. Is that because they don't necessarily consider it to be device related, which I would still think is more of a mod report, which may be in parallel with a sentinel event, but is that what creates that differentiation from state by state?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit about kind of the classification and the root cause of it. Is it device related? Is it not device related? And it varies. I wouldn't be able to necessarily answer one specific answer for that, but in any event where you do have a patient burn, of course, that needs to be absolutely reported. That is a quality issue. But what you'll find is oftentimes, even the ones that are near misses, right? Maybe it was just a singe drape, but maybe the patient didn't get burned or something like that. You oftentimes find those near misses to be very underreported. And when you're looking at the grand scheme of the metrics and the numbers and the quality data that's out there, that's a big gap. When it comes to quality in any industry, if you're not aware and if you don't have good data on what's going on out there, how are you expected to improve or identify that you have issues and to come up with solutions and implement solutions that drive down those incidence rates and increase safety and quality?
Okay, so I want to take us back just a little bit to talk about surgical fires maybe as a whole. When we talk about fires, we all get taught that fires, there's a triangle. You have to have the 3 different ingredients to actually have a fire. And everyone during Fire Safety Week is going to be getting educated on all of these facts. But I'd like you to break it down for us. What makes up the fire triangle, and what are those things in the operating room that really pose a risk or a threat to us?
So, fire triangle, there's 3 sides to the triangle. The first leg is oxidizers. And so oxidizers are any kind of like medical gas that you would think of. Really what we're thinking about here is the medical oxygen that's in the OR. But in addition to that, nitrous oxide is another medical gas that's oftentimes used, which is also considered an oxidizer. So it goes beyond just oxygen. On the other leg, you have fuel. So fuel can be a number of different things. For example, it could be the patient's skin or their hair. But oftentimes what you'll find in terms of fuel are any vapors that are kind of lingering around. We all know about, prep, surgical site prep, and waiting 3 minutes, which is a very important rule. And if you've got anything that's soaked or saturated with that kind of solution, that could then be considered fuel as well. So think about kind of cotton towels or even drapes and things like that. Now, most drapes are non-flammable, but they do melt very easily. And so those are considered fuel types. And then when it comes to ignition sources, which is our third and final leg of the triangle, we've got a number of different things there. Depending on the surgery, you'll oftentimes find an electrosurgical pencil, like a Bovie pencil. that are very much routinely used in almost all specialties and almost all cases. In addition to that, you've got fiber optic light cables and light sources that pump out an intense amount of light, which can then result in a lot of heat as well. And then lastly, lasers for the more specific, specialized types of cases. And what's interesting about the fire triangle is in any other situation outside of the surgery setting, it's very easy to prevent contact or the interaction between any one of these legs of the triangle. But in the surgery setting, you need all three of those, and all three of those are present, which is very interesting. And so you have this higher risk level of these ingredients interacting on the surgical site or in the surgical field. And that's really kind of where that risk is elevated. Additionally, those who are responsible for each leg of the triangle are different. For example, in a surgical environment, anesthesia is responsible for oxidizers, the circulator is responsible for fuel, and the surgeon is responsible for the ignition source. And because all three of these folks are different, it just highlights the importance from a surgical fire safety perspective to keep prevention in mind and to keep being proactive in mind.
I'm glad that you said the word risk, because that feeds right into the next thing I want to talk about, because our ORs are just rife with one part of the triangle or the other. We've got it all in there, every single OR. And so we are constantly dealing and faced with paying attention to what's around us, what we're doing, because it does put us and our patients at risk for fire, which is one of the reasons why we now do a fire risk assessment during the timeout. And why do you think that's so important? And can you maybe even break down really what we should be doing when we talk about a fire risk assessment besides throwing out a couple numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we want to also, talk about how important it is to do a timeout.
Right.
We're
right.
in the US, we're hitting pretty good numbers right now. We're well above 90%, but we can always be doing better. A timeout is a great opportunity for every single member of that OR to come together to focus on what's important, which is patient safety. And in that environment and in that opportunity, yes, fire risk scores are important and must be called out. So typically you're scoring a 1, 2, or 3, and I believe we're all familiar with the scoring structure. For example, if you're above the xiphoid, you're scored higher, and if you're using multiple different types of ignition sources and you have O2 present, your score is a lot higher. And so, Melanie, you bring up a great point. Instead of just spitting out a number, what else can we be doing? And what else we can be doing is taking it one step further, right? If you are scoring a case to have a high fire risk score, and you're understanding, these ingredients are present, maybe even just doing like a quick mental check, right? That takes maybe a few more seconds in your timeout, but double checking with anesthesia, making sure that the drapes are not tented, that there's good ventilation in and around the patient, that there's no O2 pooling near them. Double checking with the surgeon that, hey, not only do you have this bovie, you've got a light cable on the field as well, or you've got a laser that's being used and both of these things are on standby, or there's some type of preventative solution that's in the field that is de-risking that ignition source. And so just little call outs like that will raise awareness a little bit psychologically, just so folks are a little bit more aware of these rather than just it being a number, which is a little less tangible than when you're calling out specific things.
Yeah, I think we become too familiar with the numbers when we're going through our timeout process. If we're at a facility that really enforces the fire risk assessment, and if I remember when they first started at our facility making us do the fire risk assessment, it's one of those things where the instructions came down from on high that we had to do it, but there wasn't really maybe a lot of education as to why and what was the purpose other than it's to prevent fire risk and it's from AO we're in, and so we need to do this. But I think breaking it down, like what you said, to really make sure people understand why we're doing it, but moving it a step beyond just giving me 1, 2, or 3, and actually let's work as a team and make sure that we've mitigated these risks is really the point of the fire risk in the timeout, to make sure that we're protecting our patient and protecting ourselves. So I think that was a very good explanation. So the other thing that always gets talked about during Fire Safety Week, and anytime we have to do mock evacuations and whatnot, is race and pass. How important are those to fire safety and education?
Yeah, those are super important when it comes to race and pass. And really, it boils down to when we were all kids, right? You're doing fire drills and stuff in elementary school and junior high and high school. It's important. And the reason being is a surgical fire is a serious event. It's kind of like an emergency situation, right? It's something that no one expects. Yes, it's rare, but the effects can be catastrophic. I mean, think about the fact that there's a captive patient, right, that doesn't have any reflexes, typically under general anesthesia. And now the staff needs to get involved to be able to prevent and mitigate that surgical fire. And that's where race and pass are just so important, because you need to be able to count on your training in that high stress emergency environment to be able to refer back to the training either you're doing this week or the fire drills you've done a few months ago. Refer back to that. It should be basically, action at that point, because the seconds matter and you need to be able to get in there, rescue the patient, alarm, contain the situation, and extinguish the fire. And that brings up another good point, especially in for staff that are in these larger hospitals with 20, 25, 30 ORs. It's simply knowing where the extinguisher is. Where's the fire extinguisher located, in or outside your OR? How often are you in the same room day in and day out, right? And so those little things do make a big difference. These are just mental little checks that you want to do, because in the event something does happen, you want to be prepared and ready to act.
Well, I just think about the muscle memory of past, especially. I know that when I get stressed and I know when there's an emergency, none of us really always think clearly, but we can fall back on that muscle memory and that mental memory. And I could totally see myself pull, aim, squeeze, and sweep, pull, aim, squeeze, and sweep, going through using the fire extinguisher if I had to, because I've been told that acronym and that meaning for 20 years. I mean, my entire time in nursing. And so I think race as well is a good one to help you work through the steps of accurately or most efficiently managing a crisis and dealing with the emergency.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if you've got a fire or a patient burn that's in progress, it's the first thing you want to do, right, is to make sure you're getting the fuel away. The ignition sources are away from the patient. You're cutting off the supply to the oxidizers, things like that. And then, follow your race protocol and your pass protocol. Only use the extinguisher on the patient if it's absolutely necessary. There's other mechanisms like, smothering the fire and things like that, which are important. I will also mention, and this was an interesting thing that I came across. This was the article, Melanie, you and I were talking about the other day. Across the pond, there was an article that was written about a gentleman about 51 years of age who sustained patient burns from a surgical fire. And the staff actually didn't realize there was a fire because it was burning blue. And with the drapes that are around you that are also blue, they just didn't even realize it until it was a little too late. So being vigilant is one of the most important things you can do. And if I can stress one thing, in this entire session or episode here, is that prevention when it comes to surgical fires is incredibly important. And it goes back to Smokey the Bear, right? Only you can prevent surgical fires in this case.
Yeah, I heard a lot about vigilance, as we were kind of walking through this conversation, but then Melanie was talking about that muscle memory, and she mentioned mock evacuation. And these are all examples of how we prepare ourselves so that maybe we do have a moment like that where the drapes are blue and the flame is blue, but there's nothing more important that once the recognition is there, that we go into action immediately. Every second counts at that point, right? So can you talk about some best practices with the mock evacuation and maybe any other ideas that you have for making sure that, staff is prepared for when this happens, that they jump into action and make sure that whatever damage is mitigated?
So I think it's and I know it's difficult, and especially under these circumstances as well, right? We're dealing with some staffing shortages and folks are kind of pulled in many different directions, but the vigilance component, I think, is key. The second part, which is very important, is communication. This is true for any safety protocol or any safety initiative in the healthcare setting. There needs to be some communication, right? If there is a fire present, right, a nurse usually they're the ones that are kind of checking things out and keeping an eye on things. They need to be able to let the anesthesiologist or the CRNA staff know, hey, we've got a fire, cut the oxygen. surgeon needs to know immediately because, if they're focused on that surgical site, maybe the fire is elsewhere, maybe they haven't noticed. So the communication component's important as well. And then with the mock evacuations, I think what's important with that is practice and doing things in a step-by-step, very methodical manner. And that's not necessarily to overcomplicate things, but taking those steps and taking kind of like an algorithmic approach is important because, and understanding each one of those steps is important just because if you have an appreciation for each of those steps, you know the importance of it, you know why you're doing things. That way, when something does happen, as y'all mentioned, it's a little bit more muscle memory.
So I guess one of the things I'm thinking too is you're doing all these routine, preparedness kinds of drills and et cetera. But I think a lot of times people say something in the back of their mind like, this isn't going to happen to me. It's never happened before. It's not going to happen here. So maybe put into context for everybody, like, what's the prevalence? How often does this happen? Is it, 1 in 100 surgeries? What's the rate there?
Yeah. So the rate kind of goes back to when we were chatting about reporting requirements as well, right? And so because it's so variable state by state, the numbers are a little bit squishy. But there's some reports out there that say there are up to 650 reported surgical fires estimated that happen annually in the U.S. There's other reports that look at that number and say, based on how those numbers were derived, which are basically extrapolations, that number is actually more likely 4 times as high. And so putting it basically on the same level as in certain cases as wrong site surgery. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, it's something that you never expect. It is a rare event, but the ramifications and the effects of such an event are so catastrophic that it's something you can't disregard. And when we elaborate upon the effects and the catastrophic nature of these surgical fires, you can't ignore, of course, patient harm, burns, disfigurement, impact to life. But you also need to consider damage to property, equipment, OR downtime that may result from a big surgical fire. Even things like litigation and malpractice that result from a surgical fire need to be incorporated into your analysis. And of course, at the very end, it's staff confidence and patient confidence in themselves post-surgical fire and peace of mind. These are all very important things to elaborate on when you are looking at the effects. And when you talk to staff, or you go and you go to the AORN conference, or you go to some of these other conferences and you speak to people, I feel like every nurse has probably seen a near miss or an event that they just caught that almost could have turned into a patient burn or a surgical fire. And so it happens more often than people think. I think there's a little bit of a stigma that's maybe associated with it. I was talking to a surgical tech once, and they said, oh, yeah, we've seen, for example, scope tip burns, but, we'll just slap a tegaderm on there and then no one will know about it, right? And so this kind of also trickles back to the fact that, hey, if there is an issue from a quality perspective, let's talk about it, let's report it so that we can determine trends and we can identify solutions that we can implement that'll make a difference.
So let's talk some more about workflows then. What are some ways that our workflows can help reduce fires, or maybe even engineered solutions that exist to help with those workflows to then help reduce fires?
Yeah, I think when it comes to surgery, everything is very much choreographed, everything from the timeout to the actual surgical techniques and onwards. I think one interesting solution that maybe, at least in hindsight, talking to different surgical teams, when we're talking about engineered solutions, we've got even things like the Bovie holster, right? Things like that, which come with the peel pack. They're provided with the ignition source, in this case, an electrosurgical pencil, but they don't always fit well with the workflow. And so you'll oftentimes see that even though that holster is provided, it is very underutilized. And so when you are designing devices and engineered solutions, it's important to keep that workflow in mind, to think about the human factors, the steps that are involved in surgery, even from a proximity perspective. Where can you make a difference ethnographically that can really provide high value and high impact? When it comes to workflows, what's important, especially from a surgical fire safety perspective, where seconds count, is having a workflow from a preventative and mitigating perspective that's clear, streamlined, and balanced. You don't want it to be too overtly complicated where it becomes too much of a bear to work through, because really that's when seconds matter. When it comes to good engineering solutions that fit workflows, specifically with surgical fire safety, the best solutions have usability and human factors considerations in mind when they've been designed to make sure that they're helping to simplify workflows without adding too many unnecessary steps or compliance gaps or breaks in reliability. Oftentimes we find ourselves incorporating workaround steps, and what engineering solutions can do is add reliability and alleviate some of the bandwidth issues as well as steps that are overtly complicating the workflow. When looking at a couple of different engineered solutions that help with preventing surgical fires, one of the more ubiquitous ones is a Bovie holster or an electrosurgical pencil holster. It comes in every single pack. It's provided peel packed with the product. However, a big issue we see there, although it is easy to use, are the compliance issues. There's certain times surgical teams are not using it as consistently as they should be. Another device that provides a lot of tremendous value from a surgical fire safety perspective are surgical fire safety shields that are automated in nature, for example, for fiber optic light cables. These are great because of that automated step where you don't have to think about anything. There's no added steps to the workflow. The device reliably performs in shielding whenever you're most at risk. Now, we've talked a little bit about the preventative aspects of surgical fire safety and how engineered solutions fit into that. On the mitigating side of things, there are solutions out there, for example, automated fire suppression systems that are installed in the infrastructure of your ORs, as well as hallway doors that will close automatically to help contain smoke and fire in the OR. And all of these are great tools and examples of how engineered solutions work with workflows to help create a safer environment.
You just used a term as you were talking there, and I just want to make sure everybody's kind of familiar with it. I haven't heard anybody use it, and I looked it up while you were talking, and it makes a ton of sense in the context of what you said, but I want to sit on it for a second and have you just share it with everybody. But you used the term ethnographically. And so can you kind of just tell everybody what that means and maybe pull it back to the context real quick before we kind of leave that part of the conversation?
Sure. Yeah. Ethnographic and ethnographic research is this really cool thing that from a human factors and usability perspective, and you see this a lot in industrial design, even outside of healthcare, but it's mapping out different workflows, different processes, different procedures on a step-by-step basis. And you're effectively just interviewing the end users at each of those steps to identify where are the pain points and effectively, where's the happiness scale as well. And from there, you're identifying, what are the areas of improvement that we can highlight and we can make an impact on. And so really it's joining together the human experience, the user experience with the processes and procedures that we see and are working in on a regular basis.
What was interesting is when I looked it up, it was kind of a more traditional definition of culture. And what you just described was really about end users in their work cultures was the application of that term. So I thought that was a really interesting distinction. And so thanks for explaining that.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of this interview. Time flies when you're having fun. And I'm curious if you have any personal or shared experiences with surgical fires, besides the one that we talked about already with the patient in the UK, but anything else that you've seen or heard about related to a surgical fire?
Yeah. So for us, we're in an interesting position at Jackson Medical with our flagship device, Glow Shield, which is for fiber optic light cable burns. We'll normally get brought in anytime there has been an event or if a hospital is trying to be more proactive. So the firsthand account of light cable burns, fortunately enough, we don't see because we're implementing the solution for it, but we hear about it a lot. In addition to that, we oftentimes hear about Bovies as well. I mean, that's one of the main common ignition sources out there that result in these surgical fires. And, you'll oftentimes hear about electrosurgical cutting or coagging happening near the head and neck. And then, things can get really catastrophic very quickly. And then other things, I think you just had Richard Gamma on for laser safety. It's lasers as well. When those laser fibers break, right? and you're shooting a concentrated beam that can really create this high risk environment for a surgical fire. Even outside of the actual ignition sources, I've been in a case once where, we were in the middle of a case and we started to smell something burning, and we were just all kind of putting our heads together saying, hey, this doesn't seem right. And it was actually one of the generators or something on one of the booms that was kind of short circuiting a little bit. Yeah. And so thankfully it wasn't being used. It was on, but it wasn't being used. And so the circulator had the wherewithal to be able to turn that off, unplug it, take it out of the room, just to make sure it's not going to cause any problems through the rest of the case. And so I thought that was a great steps taken by the circulator to be able to keep that from happening.
So I had one brush with a surgical fire back when I was the manager of an OR in Texas, and it was a plastics case, and it pretty straightforward, shouldn't have been anything out of the ordinary. And then the surgeon he was using a bovie. Not sure why he was using a bovie on the face. I don't remember all of the details, but he hit that bovie and then flashed fire across the patient's face. Patient's eyelashes, eyebrows were on fire. And you just have to act in that moment, and you have to take care of the patient, take care of the problem, and then, obviously deal with the aftermath. But it brought home to me how important it is to pay attention and how important it is to really communicate. And I think that's why I can appreciate why we do the fire risk assessment in the timeout, because really communicating what activities are going to be done during the case, or making sure everybody knows we're going to be working on the head or neck, or, oxygen, all the things that we need to know beforehand to protect our patients and to protect ourselves is crucial to make sure that we have good outcomes. And I think I saw that firsthand when our patients' eyelashes and eyebrows were no longer there. So it's definitely a very serious risk.
All right, Kamil, this was a phenomenal interview. And I think it's so important to remind everyone of some of these things that we often take for granted. I think, Melanie, you were just kind of describing we do this and we kind of go through the motions, but we forget the purpose. We forget the importance. And I think talking about the stories, sharing like you both did, really helps a ton, but always re-emphasizing the why behind why we do each of these steps. So, Kamil, great job. Thanks for coming on the show, and a shout out to a prior guest, Richard Gamma. That was, usually I do that. It's great when we have somebody on the show and they're thinking of other episodes and interviews.
Thanks for having me. And before I jump off, I wanted to very quickly just highlight the importance of Fire Safety Week this week, as well as the importance of prevention, preparation, and response when it comes to surgical fire safety.
That was Kamil Makhnejia, VP of Clinical Development at Jackson Medical, and we're talking about fire safety, Melanie. And I do love it when a guest on the show does a shout out to prior episodes. And I'm going to just add a shout out because a big theme during the conversation was also timeouts. And while she wasn't a team member then, she is now. I'm just going to give some kudos to Brenna Page for her episode on timeouts, which was one of the first ones where we had gotten a lot of listener feedback that they really enjoyed that episode, that they changed their practice at their facilities as a result of listening to that episode. And I'm hoping that we can piggyback off of that and bring the purpose and the why to doing the fire risk assessment in the timeouts. And again, I'll kind of throw this out again on laser safety to Richard Gamma. We're actually recording this the day his episode releases. I know this won't go out until Fire Safety Week in October, but I think, all of the safety topics are ones that we should be revisiting over and over again.
I agree. And sometimes I think it takes hearing it with different ears and hearing it from a different voice for us to really grasp a concept and understand why. We hear it from our educators or from our leaders every 6 months. We get the same questions over and over again. They ask us the same tests. They ask us the same questions. The answers are always the same. We don't necessarily think about it. And then when we hear it in a different format and we hear it and we can really process and think about the why we're doing what we're doing, it can help us change our practice. So I think this is definitely a valuable conversation to be having.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or simply search for First Case on your favorite podcast application. We've also got bonus content. That's for certain episodes, but you've got to download our smartphone app for iPhone or Android. And while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. If you have any topics or recommendations for a future guest, just send an email on over to info@firstcasemedia.com. On behalf of Melanie and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case.